Thank you. So welcome to our webinar on safe recruitment in dance. I'm delighted to be invited to speak to you about safe recruitment in this context, with all its diversity as a sector. If you could move to the next slide, please, Erin. So I guess the key question I always have in my mind when I'm talking to organisations is why safe recruitment? What is it we're wanting to keep people safe from? And you may have your own ideas about that, but lots of people often talk about child abuse, and that's what we're keeping children safe from. When we talk about safe recruitment, it's child abuse, but actually it's any harm, and harm can look like many different things, and it can come out in many different ways. And it's really important to have that really holistic view on what we're keeping children safe from when we're applying safe recruitment principles, so we don't get fixed on what it looks like, because safeguarding changes so quickly and there's always new harms emerging. So it's really important that we think about that in that context. And it absolutely underpins why we have the legislation in place. We have a really quite robust framework of child protection in the UK. And we've got really clear legislation and statutory guidance which helps guide us and shapes what safe recruitment has become. I think, although when I've worked in statutory settings, and I've worked predominantly when I was early in HR in the public sector, and I never really came across the term safe recruitment. It was only when I started doing some voluntary work as a youth worker and then professionally moved into statutory settings that I really started to understand the significance and the importance of safe recruitment practices and how and why they've come about. And they've come about because awful, tragic things have happened to children. Children have been harmed, and that's what we have to hold at the forefront. Is yes, some of this legislation has been written for statutory settings like education. They have probably one of the very most robust pieces of guidance called Keeping Children Safe in Education, and I've seen that change significantly over time to include more and more detail, and it is quite hard to keep track of all the changes and all the different things that keep coming in, but ultimately they're coming in because something has happened, a child has been harmed, and so it's really important that we do everything we can to get these things right. So I'm not going to go over every piece of legislation and statutory guidance, because that would be a bit dull. But I just wanted you to know that it is there, and it's there for a good reason. One of the most tragic cases we have specifically around safe recruitment is the murders of the Soham children, who are 10-year-old girls, Jessica Chapman and Holly Wells, and they were murdered by their care teacher at their school. And the quote on the left there is from Sir Michael Bishard, who quite rightly says it's really difficult to detect somebody who's going to cause that level of significant harm and be, have those motivations. And I've had the question previously, certainly when I worked in the police, well, what does an offender look like? How can I know? And actually we can't know, and it's impossible to profile a person, and it's wrong to do that. We shouldn't assume that somebody looks a certain way. It's absolutely down to people's behaviour, and looking out for signs of people's behaviour. That is the real key to creating really good, robust systems around all elements of safeguarding, but that's certainly true of safe recruitment. Certainly the Children's Act promotes the safeguarding and promoting the welfare of children, but it's actually an integral part to HR management, and it's an essential part of creating safe environments as well. Erin, could you move us on to the next slide, please? So in terms of the child protection framework and the legislation that you have that I've talked about, and then you've got your statutory guidance. The other really key significant framework that you will all have access to is your local safeguarding partnership procedures, where they will actually outline what they expect in terms of safe recruitment. And I would recommend anybody to go and have a look at their regional safeguarding partnership procedures. So the easiest way to do that is to look up your local authority and your safeguarding partnership. They will have a page specifically for that, and on there you'll be able to find procedures, and you'll be able to find procedures around safe recruitment and also managing allegations of abuse against staff. And those two really are the two areas that I practice most in, and you will always find me looking at different regional procedures, because they do vary. And they vary because the context of harm varies in, you know, different contextual environments. And that's also really important to factor in when you're looking at safeguarding and safe recruitment as a holistic approach. And then our own procedures, our own organisational procedures really are underpinned by all of those all of that framework that I've just outlined. So if you are new to developing policy and procedures, again, the safeguarding local partnership procedures are a really good starting point and steer to telling you what absolutely needs to be in there. The hard part is then applying that to your context. And that's the thing that we help organisations with the most, is making that then make sense. But there are some absolute things that every organisation, no matter how big or small, should be doing. And what we've done at the NSPCC, if we look at safe recruitment, it's a really popular area in 5 different stages, which you will see on your screen now. So the first stage is really, really important. It's about preparing to recruit. So that could be a safeguarding statement in your adverts as they go out. It could be, or every role should have a job description, or if it's a staff role, or if it's a volunteer, then a role profile. It's really, really important that those are in place for every single role that has contact with children or adults, actually, because there's a real transitional age in safeguarding where you cut off from being a child to an adult in terms of safeguarding legislation, but actually your vulnerability remains the same. If you're at risk of grooming or harm within a sector like dance, actually it's not going to, a child's vulnerability or a person's vulnerability isn't going to change. So although we talk very much, because we're a child protection charity, about child protection having roles that work with children, I would say a role profile, no matter how small the task of a role is, should be in place for every role that has contact with any of your members of your groups. Because they are the key thing that then underpins anything that you can do as an organisation to protect yourselves and to follow the right processes. So within your role descriptions, it's really important to have really strong safeguarding messages about your expectations around safeguarding and safer practice. It's really good to have a self-disclosure form so that you're asking people to tell them a bit more about themselves through self-disclosure. But with a self-disclosure form, it's really important to have the associated guidance. So within all of this, you're asking for personal information, and it's really important that you're really clear about what you're going to do with that information, why you're asking for that information. So the planning is really important, because you don't want to start any recruitment process without having any of that in place, because it's not going to be done thoroughly or robustly enough for it to be effective. And then it not only wastes everybody's time, but it's more likely that you're going to be dealing with more serious concerns later on if something was to go wrong and you didn't have those things in place. It's far easier to hold somebody to account for their behaviour if you can sit down with them and show them their role profile and say, look, this is what our expectations are and you're not meeting those, and this is what we're going to put in place. If you don't have those expectations in place, it just makes it far more challenging. So the next stage is about selecting the right people. And we look at that, we have little, all of these are little things you can have in place around checking application forms. So in the first place, having a template application form as opposed to asking for CVs. CVs can make it really easy for people to disguise information or miss out information. And as a recruiter, it makes it really challenging actually to get lots of different variations of CVs. It's much easier to look at any concerns, pick up any abnormalities, anomalies within an application form. When you're looking at a few application forms, if they're all in a consistent format, than it is to look at different styles of CV. So having clear criteria, having a shortlisting process, these are all of some of the really key steps that you would want in place to ensure you're recruiting safely and fairly. So it's not just about safe recruitment in terms of protecting children, it's also about making the process safe for people who are applying for these roles so that they're treated fairly and respectfully. So choosing wisely is our third stage that we talk about, and that involves, making sure you've got a range of selection tools when you're looking at a recruitment process. That's going to help you. Ultimately, safe recruitment is your opportunity to learn and understand more about an individual than you probably will at any other stage of your time with them, because particularly within dance, with any organisation, it's very rare that people are so busy in their roles, it's very rare that you're going to have these types of conversations again. So it's really important that you use this as an opportunity to ask really pertinent questions, to get about a real good understanding of an individual and their motivation to wanting to come and work with you as a whether that be as a dance teacher or a tutor, so that you know that you've asked the right questions in a fair process. You're not just asking a question because you've heard something about somebody. It's all in a very fair process with clear selection tools, clear questions of what you're going to ask, and the same things and the same processes applied for each role. I think that's really important. It allows you to make a more informed judgment, and it allows you to make a decision, based on accurate information and that's done in a fair way. The fourth stage is checking thoroughly, and that's also often called the vetting process. And that involves your criminal record checks, your overseas criminal record checks, health checks potentially, right to work checks, checking identity, and the referencing process. Now, those are all really quite detailed processes in their own right. So you can see the breadth of the steps that take a really robust safe recruitment process, and hopefully why they're so important. And if you put the groundwork in and getting some of these planned out, it really will save you so much time in the future. And also it gives you the confidence that you are getting these things right. Things always, they always go wrong in places. We're never going to see a world where mistakes aren't made. However, what we see from learning from case reviews that I've looked at is that there are themes, there are certain things that are missed, and the common factors around those are usually around time and resources as to why some of these steps are missed out. And the fifth stage is remaining vigilant, and I've got a couple of slides around that later on, so I'll just skip to the next slide, please, Erin. So one of the areas that I really wanted to pull out is a question that I get asked about quite regularly, which is around referencing. So the referencing is really tricky because what people commonly say to me is that I only ever get dates back, and quite often as an organisation they only give the dates out themselves. So what we really recommend is having a reference pro forma, having a role profile or a job description, and sending those out together to your person's referees. And that gives you much more success rate in terms of somebody looking at the role and remembering this individual and saying, oh, I'm not sure they're right for that role. This is how what evidence have I got from that? It gives them more opportunity to answer certain questions around suitability of a person in a reference pro forma than if you just send out a request for a reference to confirm dates. So there's some couple of do's and don'ts around references here. Really, important again around fairness to approach referees for all shortlisted applicants. If you're working with schools, you really should be looking at the Keeping Children Safe in Education guidance. It is expected that any organisation that works with schools is aware of that statutory guidance, and these are the nuances that sometimes come out in safe recruitment. So in Keeping Children Safe in Education with schools, it's recommended that you apply for references before interview, so that you can ask questions at interview should there be anything that comes out of that. So the other really important thing about referencing is to verify the reference. Build into your processes an opportunity to have that phone conversation with the referee. I've received your reference and I noticed that you've missed this question, or you've mentioned this, can you tell me a bit more about it? It's more likely that people are going to give you some information about an individual and their suitability over the phone than they would be prepared to commit to in writing. None of this is saying that these things, by putting all these things in place, is going to stop someone from hiding something, or you getting the full picture. But you're in a much better opportunity if you do ask these questions at these times to gather that information. It's all about gathering information through safe recruitment, so that at the end of the process you can make a really well judged decision that stands up to scrutiny. Because you're dealing with people's personal information and you're asking questions about suitability of individuals, it's really important that you can justify why you're doing that and why you then come to a decision if it's a decision that a candidate might not be wanting to hear if they were unsuccessful. It's really important to have those open channels of communication, and that all builds into the safe culture. Next slide, please, Erin. So I've got a slide here just about equality of assessment, really, which is just to emphasise different things that you can do to make your safe recruitment process fair. So try and have more than 2 people on your panel when you're shortlisting, when you're conducting interviews. Again, just to emphasise, really important that you have role profiles and role descriptions that have a person specification, because that's your foundation for addressing anything, recruitment decisions. Later on, when somebody is in post, it allows you to use that to say, to hold meetings to address concerns about behaviour or concerns about conduct. Much easier to do that, much fairer on you and the individual if you have the person specification that shows the expectations for the role. Next slide, please, Erin. And the other key thing that I really wanted to pull out from this session was trying to build into your process a safeguarding interview or a safer interview. And it's different to a technical interview that's looking at somebody's skills and what they can bring to the role. Quite often in dance, what we see is that there's a real emphasis, and it's the same in teaching when I work with schools, there's a real emphasis on how somebody can teach. Where did they go? What school were they part of? The prestigious around that, and more time is spent on all of that to get a good teacher who's got quality experience themselves, rather than a focus on actually how do they meet this in terms of their suitability in how they interact with children and young people. And the way to try and tease that out is through a safer interview process with a very different technique, and we offer training around that. And it really draws on some of the findings from some of the inquiries around looking at why somebody is motivated to work with children and young people, what's really driving them for that role, and asking some really important questions. You know, asking them to give examples of when they've had to deal with a situation where a student was demonstrating difficult behaviour. How did they deal with that? What would they do in that situation? Those are really important questions to understand at this stage of a recruitment process. You cannot ask those to thinking about those later on when something's happened is very difficult. If you try and get a sense of how someone has behaved in the past, is a much better indicator of how they may then perform in terms of their suitability in the future. So factoring in a safer interview, I think, is a really, really valuable step in any process. Really difficult to do, I understand, in terms of time and resource. Schools very much struggle with this. They usually do a combined approach, so half of the interview will be the technical, half the interview will be the safer recruitment interview. Okay, next slide please, Erin. We've come up at the NSPCC, and when we've been developing our safer interviewing techniques, some positive safeguarding behaviours that we would expect all candidates to demonstrate. And we've developed questions that ask specific things around these areas. And it's really about, you know, somebody's resilience when they're working with children and young people. How self-aware are they? Are they open to sharing information and their concerns? And then they're not somebody that just works in isolation and no one ever sees them, but they've managed to connect and develop these really, really personal relationships with children and young people. So these are all the areas that we would expect you to be able to probe quite safely within a safer recruitment process. Next slide, please. So the last couple of slides are just all about this safer recruitment being viewed in a holistic process around safer cultures, and remaining vigilant at all times. So once somebody's in post, it doesn't stop there. You know, it's really important to have a really clear induction process where you go through your safeguarding expectations and processes for dealing with any concerns or worries. A probation period if they're a staff member, or maybe you might have a trial period if they're a volunteer. A really clear and comprehensive allegations process. And again, I would really encourage you to look at safeguarding procedures in your local area, which will go through step by step what that looks like. And a learning culture. It's really important that you're constantly looking at it. I always find when I do a piece of work with an organisation, whether it be on a safer recruitment policy or a managing allegations against abuse policy, and that's it, the work's done. And actually, no, the work's never done, because safeguarding is moving so quickly all the time. So we have to have review dates into our processes and our policies, that if something's happened, even if it's just a small concern, we use that as an opportunity to look back and review the process. Could we make any changements? What improvements could we make? Next slide, please, Darren. So this is our jigsaw diagram, and it really is just to highlight all the different elements of a safer culture. So it's really important to have other policies and procedures as well as your safer recruitment policy and procedure. So whistleblowing policy, code of conduct and safer practice go hand in hand with safer recruitment for me. You can use your code of conduct and safer practice guidance, policy, whatever you call it. You can use that to ask questions, develop your interview questions, make it real and put it in the context of your environment. Don't Google and lift questions from the internet, because they are there, but actually for me it's about stepping back and really thinking about this in your context. What does this say about us, and what do we want other people who come and work for us to commit to? And next slide please, Erin. So learning from past mistakes, you know, sadly, you know, child protection, there's always cases in the news, there's always learning to be done. Even, you know, within the dance industry, You've got cases like Ballet West and Anne Harris School of Dance, you know, where certainly in the Anne Harris School of Dance reminded me of other cases that I've read and worked on, where the dance teacher was known as creepy Neil. And it's that kind of normalization of this language of it's okay because they're just creepy, and actually no one's going further to say, no adult is asking the question, why are the children saying that? What's leading to hear that person becoming known? And I mean, that's quite a extreme example, but I think look for the little things that children are telling you in their studios, in their sessions, because it's really important to pick up those signs early and then do something about it and ask those right questions. So never think you've done enough in terms of a safe culture. Always believe it could happen here. Keep safeguarding high on everyone's agenda, and never rely on one process to keep children safe. I think I've been saying those same full statements for many years, but they've never rung truer. So I really hope those things resonate with you. Next slide, please, Erin. So I appreciate that's a really whistle-stop tour through safe recruitment. There's so much that I just wanted to highlight in this session, and give you a real overview of the things to really look out for. We didn't really go into much detail around criminal record checks, because quite often when I start working with an organisation, that the emphasis is always on the criminal record check, and that is only one check, and it's only ever going to be as up to date as the day you do it, and it's only ever going to give you information about an individual. It doesn't rule anybody out. It enables you to ask more questions. So with any of the information you get and learn about an individual, it's really important to have a really robust risk assessment process in place, so that you're creating that safe space for people to be really open and honest and have that really honest discussion about somebody's suitability.
Thank you, Chloe, very much. That was really informative, a lot to take in for people, I think, but really, really helpful.